Imagine the shock of a single piece of paper changing everything in a royal household. That is exactly what happened when Prince William made a move that nobody inside the palace saw coming until it was already done. And the wildest part isn't even the financial freeze itself. It is that the whole thing traces back to Camilla's ex-husband, Andrew Parker Bowles, walking into a private meeting with King Charles and handing over something he had been sitting on for literal decades. That is where this starts, not with William, not with some dramatic showdown. It starts with a man Camilla was married to before any of this was even on the horizon, deciding that whatever he knew had finally reached its expiration date. The first sign that something had shifted came in the form of a memo. A single page circulated through the internal palace system on a Tuesday morning. The kind of document that normally gets a glance and a file folder and never gets thought about again. But the staff who read this one didn't file it. They read it twice. Some of them read it 3 times. And then they looked at each other with that specific expression people have when they realize something permanent just happened, and nobody is going to explain it to them directly. The memo was about Queen Camilla's household finances. Her travel budget, her staffing allocations, her personal accounts, the entire administrative infrastructure that lets a queen consort's office function as a queen consort's office. All of it was being placed under immediate suspension, pending what the document called a review of expenditure. No timeline, no context, no explanation, and the name on the authorization line at the bottom wasn't Camilla's. It wasn't Charles's. It was the office of the Prince of Wales. William had signed it himself. Now the language here matters more than it looks like at first glance. A review of expenditure is not an investigation. It carries no legal weight, no formal accusation, no public exposure. On paper, it is the most boring administrative phrase an institution can produce. But inside a royal household where nobody except the sovereign himself has ever suspended financial arrangements touching a queen consort, the word review landed with the weight of something much heavier. By 9 that morning, the courtiers had gone into that particular kind of silence that palaces produce when something genuinely significant has happened, and no one has been authorized to speak about it. Staff moved carefully. Conversations got shorter. The surface rhythms of the morning continued, but underneath something else was moving entirely. What made the silence louder was a single absence. Camilla wasn't there. She had a routine engagement scheduled for that morning, a quick visit to charity she had supported for years. The kind of low-profile appearance that doesn't generate much press. It had been canceled, not rescheduled. Canceled. No statement, no explanation to the organization expecting her. Her office door, which normally would have been opened by 8, stayed closed. Her personal secretary arrived, checked the corridor, and left without entering. A member of her household staff came to collect her morning correspondence and found the tray outside untouched. She always took them herself. Always. The staff member later told a colleague that in 20 years she had never left them sitting. William had been seen leaving a private meeting with 2 of his legal advisors at 7 that morning. By 8:15, the memo was circulating. By 9, the palace understood that something had happened that couldn't easily be undone. What nobody understood yet was where it had really begun or who had handed William the reason to end it. Charles had known since the previous evening. The people closest to him would later describe those hours between that private conversation and the following morning as some of the most visibly difficult they had witnessed in years of close service. Not difficult in a dramatic sense. No raised voices, no visible collapse, none of the outward signs people associate with crisis. The difficulty was quieter than that, and in a lot of ways harder to watch. It was the difficulty of a man who had been given information he couldn't unknow, and who had spent the night sitting with it entirely alone. He canceled dinner that night, a small thing easily explained. A king's schedule shifts constantly, and nobody receiving a brief message from his private secretary would have read anything into it without context. But the people who knew his habits understood that the evening meal, taken privately but with at least one member of staff in attendance, was the one consistent rhythm he protected no matter what the day had brought. He hadn't canceled it in recent memory. He canceled it that night. By morning, the people working most closely with him noted the specific quality of his composure. Not the composed stillness of a man at peace with the decision, but the composed stillness of a man who has made one he can't take back and is now carrying it through the ordinary requirements of the day. His eyes, one aide would privately remark weeks later, looked like the eyes of someone who hadn't slept, but who decided sleep was no longer the relevant question. Catherine said nothing publicly. That wasn't unusual. She rarely did, and she had long understood that the most powerful thing a person in her position could offer in a moment of institutional turbulence was the absence of anything that could be used. But the people who observed her closely that morning noticed something in her manner that went beyond ordinary restraint. She was present, attentive, entirely correct in every visible way, and entirely unreachable. The particular distance she maintained wasn't coldness, it was protection. Protection of William, of her children, of the space around the decision her husband had made that she would neither complicate nor abandon. Princess Anne appeared at a scheduled engagement that morning and completed it without deviation. Observers noted only that her interactions with staff were somewhat shorter than usual. Her responses clipped in the way that for her has always signaled internal preoccupation rather than displeasure. Whether she had been informed of the memo's contents or had simply felt the atmospheric shift that moves through a royal household when something structural has changed wasn't something anyone could confirm. But she had spent enough decades inside that institution to read its silences accurately. She read this one and she said nothing. The staff felt it most directly. Two members of Camilla's household office who arrived that morning were quietly told by a senior administrator that their schedules for the day had been suspended and they should make themselves available for further instruction. They were given no further instruction. They sat in a small anteroom for the better part of 2 hours, and neither of them asked the question they were both thinking, because they already understood that no one in that building was yet authorized to answer it. None of them, not Charles in his sleepless composure, not Catherine in her careful distance, not Anne in her clipped efficiency, not the two staff members waiting with no schedule and no explanation, understood yet that the sequence of events hadn't begun inside the palace at all. It had begun 6 weeks earlier with a meeting arranged through channels that left no official record between a king and the man his wife had been married to before him. 6 weeks before the memo, a message was passed through an intermediary. Not through official channels, not through the structured correspondence systems that govern communication between senior royal figures, not through any of the formal pathways that leave records and require acknowledgement and pass through the hands of private secretaries trained to document everything. The message moved instead through a retired equerry, a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades in and around royal service, who knew both households in the way that only long proximity produces, and whose name would mean nothing to the public, but carried in the relevant circles the particular weight of someone trusted, precisely because he had never given anyone a reason not to trust him. The message was simple. Andrew Parker Bowles was requesting a private audience with the king. The request itself wasn't entirely without precedent. The two men weren't strangers. They had moved through overlapping worlds for decades. Military circles, the particular social geography of the English countryside, the kinds of formal occasions where people who share a complicated history nonetheless find themselves in the same room and manage it with the practiced ease of their class and generation. They weren't close, but they weren't the kind of not close that produces awkwardness. They were the kind of not close that two men arrive at when they have each, in their own way, made a private peace with a situation neither of them chose, and both of them had to live with regardless. What made this request different was the channel through which it arrived and the instruction attached to it. Andrew Parker Bowles had asked specifically that the meeting not be logged. No entry in the official diary. No staff present, no record of the conversation beyond whatever the two men chose to carry away from it themselves. In a household where nearly every interaction involving the king passes through at least one layer of documentation, this request was unusual enough that the equerry who carried it apparently paused before delivering it, not from reluctance, but from an awareness that he was handing across something that once handed could not be retrieved. Charles agreed to the meeting. Those who learned of it afterward, and very few did, described his agreement as something between reluctance and inevitability, as though he had understood from the specific nature of the request and the specific identity of the man making it, that whatever Andrew Parker Bowles had carried to this point, he had now decided he could no longer carry alone. And that understanding, rather than producing resistance in Charles, had produced something quieter. An acceptance that the conversation was going to happen, and that the only question was whether he met it directly or waited for it to find him another way. The meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon at a private address in the countryside. Not a royal residence, not a club, not any location with a connection to either man's official life. A house belonging to the retired equerry, made available for the purpose with the kind of discreet generosity that old networks produce without needing to discuss. What Andrew Parker Bowles said during that meeting remained between the two men, but what Charles looked like when he returned that evening was something his staff would remember. Not shaken, not angry, something more difficult to name than either of those things. The look of a man who had just been handed something he recognized and had been hoping for a very long time that he would never have to hold. Charles did not summon Camilla through the usual channels. No message passed through a private secretary, no entry added to the official diary, no formal notation of the kind that transforms a private conversation into an institutional record. He simply sent word through a single member of staff who was given nothing to write down that he wished to speak with her that afternoon. The informality of it was itself a signal. In a household where even the most intimate exchanges between senior members of the family move through at least one layer of administrative structure, The absence of that structure communicated something that no accompanying message could have made plainer. She came within the hour. The room Charles had chosen was one they both knew well. A smaller sitting room on the upper floor of the private residence, used for conversations that required distance from the working areas of the household. A room without the furniture of official life, no desk to establish authority, no arrangement of chairs designed to manage the power between two people, just a room and two people in it, and a document on the low table between them that Charles had placed there before she arrived and had not touched since. Camilla looked at the document before she looked at him. It was a single sheet, a photocopy, not an original, bearing a date from the period immediately following her divorce from Andrew Parker Bowles, years before her marriage to Charles had been contemplated in any formal sense. The contents, as Charles would later describe to his most senior advisor in the broadest possible terms, related to a private financial arrangement entered into during that period. An agreement documented in writing that suggested she had used knowledge acquired through her proximity to royal circles, knowledge she had no official standing to possess at that time, as a form of leverage in a negotiation that was on its surface entirely private. It wasn't in isolation a matter that carried legal consequence, but it was a document that, in the hands of anyone with the context to understand what it described, told a story about judgment, about the relationship between private conduct and public trust, about what a person had been willing to do at a moment when no one was watching, in the years before the world began watching her very closely. Charles asked her one question, not an accusation delivered with the force of certainty, but a question shaped with the careful precision of a man who had spent the previous 6 weeks deciding exactly how to hold what he had been given. He asked her to help him understand what the arrangement had been. The silence that followed lasted long enough that its length became its own kind of answer, and then Camilla spoke, not to deny the document's existence and not to challenge its authenticity. She spoke instead to reframe it. The arrangement had been mischaracterized. She said the context had been lost. What appeared on the page as leverage was in her telling nothing more than a private negotiation between two people untangling a complicated shared life. And the knowledge she had used was no more privileged than anything two people accumulate simply by moving through the same world. Charles listened. He did not interrupt, and when she finished, he did not respond to what she had said. He asked her instead about Andrew Parker Bowles. Specifically, he asked whether she had any understanding of why Andrew had chosen to bring this forward now, after so many years of having chosen not to. The question settled in the room, and Camilla, who had spent decades learning to navigate the precise terrain between what was said and what was meant inside this family, made the one response that told Charles everything the document alone had left uncertain. She didn't say that what Andrew Parker Bowles had shown him was untrue. She asked why he would do this to her. The meeting between Charles and Camilla ended without resolution. That was itself a form of resolution. In a household where private conversations between senior members of the family are rarely permitted to simply conclude without some agreed framework, some understanding of next steps, some mutual acknowledgement of what has been said and what it requires, the absence of any such framework was a decision in itself. Charles did not tell her what he intended to do. He did not offer reassurance. He did not reach for the document on the table between them when she left, which meant that when she walked out of that room, the paper remained exactly where he had placed it before she arrived, waiting. Within 48 hours, the palace's internal financial review office had received new instructions. The instructions did not come through Camilla's household. They did not pass through the normal chain of communication that would have given her office any formal notification of what was being set in motion. They arrived instead through the king's private secretary, addressed to the keeper of the privy purse, the senior official responsible for the financial administration of the royal household, in the form of a memorandum that requested, in the careful language of institutional procedure, a comprehensive review of all expenditure associated with the Queen Consort's office over the preceding 3 years. The keeper of the privy purse had served in his role long enough to understand that a request of this nature, arriving through this channel without prior discussion and without an accompanying explanation, was not a routine administrative exercise. He arrived, read the memorandum, and asked 2 questions. The first concerned the scope of the review. The second concerned who else had been informed. The answer to the second question was the one that told him everything the memorandum itself had not said. William had been included, not notified after the fact, not briefed as a courtesy to the heir apparent. Included, present in the initial conversation from which the memorandum had emerged. His office copied on the instructions, his name appearing in the authorization chain in a position that placed him not as an observer of the process, but as a participant in directing it. In 20 years of royal financial administration, the keeper could not recall a precedent for the Prince of Wales occupying that position in a matter involving the Queen Consort's household. The legal dimension was handled with equivalent care. Senior counsel was engaged not to investigate but to advise, a distinction that mattered enormously because investigation implies a conclusion waiting to be reached, while advice implies only a desire to understand the boundaries of what the institution could and could not do within its own structures. The advice, when it came, was characteristically precise. What had been described to counsel fell within the sovereign's absolute discretion over the management of royal household finances. No external body needed to be involved. No public process was required. The institution could manage this entirely within itself. That was the word used in the legal advice, and it was the word that mattered most within. The machinery had already begun moving, but William had not yet shown Camilla the full extent of what he had assembled. That confrontation was still to come, and it would happen not in a quiet sitting room chosen for its distance from official life, but somewhere far less private than either of them had anticipated. The changes began quietly, as the most consequential changes inside a royal household always do. Not with announcements, not with statements issued through official channels or briefings offered to the press, but with small observable alterations to the ordinary texture of daily life inside the palace. The kind of changes that mean nothing to anyone without context, and mean everything to the people who have spent years learning to read the institution through its details. Camilla's engagement diary was the first visible sign. 3 appearances scheduled across the following fortnight, a hospital visit, a reception connected to one of her longest-standing patronages, a ceremony at which she had been expected to represent the crown, were removed without rescheduling. The organizations involved received brief communications from her office, citing scheduling conflicts. None of them were given alternative dates. The staff who managed her public calendar, accustomed to the constant negotiation of a queen consort's diary, understood that a scheduling conflict that produces no rescheduling is not a scheduling conflict. It is a removal. 2 members of her household office were quietly reassigned. The process was handled with the particular efficiency that the palace reserves for personnel changes it does not wish to draw attention to. No formal announcement, no acknowledgement in any internal communication that would create a paper trail connecting the reassignment to anything beyond routine administrative reorganization. Their desks were cleared over a single weekend. Their building access was adjusted the following Monday morning. When colleagues asked, they were told only that both individuals had been moved to support roles in other departments. The description vague enough to confirm nothing and deny nothing, which was precisely its purpose. The official website updated its language around her patronages within the same week. The changes were subtle enough that most readers wouldn't have noticed them. Active descriptions of her role, phrases that positioned her as a current functioning presence within each organization, were softened into language that referenced her historical association instead. Present tense quietly replaced by past, ongoing replaced by long-standing. The kind of editorial shift that a communications team makes when it has been told to create distance without being told to explain why. Then came the letter from the keeper of the privy purse. It was addressed to the relevant financial institutions in the careful formal register of royal administrative correspondence. A register designed to communicate authority while volunteering nothing unnecessary. It placed an administrative hold on the accounts associated with Camilla's household operations. Not a freeze in any legal sense, a hold. The distinction existed on paper. In practice, the effect was the same. The accounts through which her office had managed its day-to-day expenditure, staffing costs, travel, the operational requirements of a working royal household, were no longer accessible without additional authorization that only one office could now provide. William's office. A member of her personal staff arrived that Thursday morning to find the correspondence tray outside her private rooms untouched for the 2nd consecutive day. The letters sat exactly where they had been placed the evening before. She had always collected them herself. Regardless of what else the morning held, the tray had never once been left waiting. One final meeting still remained, and unlike every exchange that had come before it, this one had not been arranged through intermediaries or managed through the careful buffer of institutional protocol. William had asked to see her directly. She had not refused. She was already in the room when he arrived. Whether that was by design or simply the consequence of having arrived early, no one who was present in the corridor outside could say with certainty. What they could say was that when William entered, she did not stand. She remained in the chair she had chosen, not the one closest to the door, not the one that would have positioned her nearest to the exit, but the one beside the window with the afternoon light behind her and the room's full length between herself and where he would be sitting. A small arrangement, the kind that communicates nothing openly and everything to anyone paying attention. William sat. He did not place anything on the table between them. No documents, no files, no visible evidence of the weeks of work that had preceded this moment. He had made a deliberate decision to bring none of it into the room, and the absence of those materials was its own statement that what needed to be said between them did not require paper to support it. He spoke first. He told her that he had not asked to meet in order to revisit the evidence or to deliver any further institutional consequence, or to continue the argument that neither of them had formally begun. He said that he had asked to see her because there was something he needed her to understand that no memorandum and no financial review could communicate, something that existed for him beneath the level of institution entirely. He told her about the quality of silence he remembered most from his childhood, not the silence of conflict. He had been too young for much of it to fully comprehend the conflict as conflict. What he remembered was the other silence, the particular quiet of a woman who had learned over years that the institutions surrounding her would not amplify her voice regardless of what she placed inside it, who had understood that the protection she had been led to expect was conditional in ways that were never made explicit, and who had carried that understanding alone because there was nowhere inside that world to put it without cost. He was not equating the situations. He said that clearly. And Camilla, who had been watching him with an expression that gave away very little, gave away something at that, a slight shift in the set of her shoulders. The particular adjustment of a person who is prepared for one kind of conversation and has just understood they are in a different one. He said only that he had watched what silence protected in this institution and what it cost the people it was meant to protect, and that he decided at some point he couldn't precisely identify that he was not willing to extend that silence simply because extending it was easier than the alternative. Camilla did not respond immediately. When she did speak, she said something that none of the people outside the room would ever hear repeated, because William didn't repeat it and neither did she. Whatever passed between them in the minutes that followed stayed in that room completely. What left the room was different from what had entered it. Not resolution, not warmth, something more honest than either. A mutual acknowledgement of what had always been true between them, finally spoken into a space that could hold it without requiring anything further to be done about it. The door opened 20 minutes after it had closed. William left first. Camilla remained seated by the window for a while longer. Outside, the palace continued its afternoon in the ordinary way. Somewhere beyond its walls, the story was already moving toward people who had not yet heard it. The first report appeared at 11:43 on a Thursday morning. Not in a tabloid, not through the kind of anonymous tip that produces a breathless single-paragraph item buried in a gossip column. It appeared in the financial pages of a broadsheet. A careful, precisely worded item filed by a correspondent who covered institutional finance and who had spent enough years adjacent to the structures of royal administration to understand what she was looking at when a source placed a document in front of her. The item was 3 paragraphs long. It named no individual directly. It described in the restrained register of financial journalism an administrative hold placed on accounts associated with a senior member of the royal household, pending an internal review of expenditure authorized at the level of the heir apparent's office. 3 paragraphs, no name, no accusation, no dramatic language of any kind. By 1 o'clock, every major outlet in the United Kingdom had it. The speed of amplification wasn't driven by the item itself, but by what every editor and senior correspondent understood the item to mean once they had read it carefully enough. A financial hold, senior household, heir apparent authorization. The gaps between those phrases weren't gaps at all. They were the story. And the story required no additional source material to become the only thing anyone in British media was discussing. By early afternoon, phones rang across newsrooms. Editors pulled correspondence from other assignments. The particular electricity that moves through a press corps when something genuinely significant has surfaced, not rumored, not sourced to the usual anonymous proximity, but documented in financial language that does not speculate, moved through the afternoon with remarkable speed. Constitutional experts were contacted within the hour. Their responses divided along a line that had less to do with the facts than with what the respondents believed the facts signified. One camp, those who viewed the monarchy primarily as an institution requiring internal mechanisms of accountability, framed what had happened as a sign of structural health, a system correcting itself from within through the appropriate channels without external intervention. They argued that the institution was capable of managing its own integrity. The other camp was less reassured. Scholars of constitutional history noted that a financial suspension of this nature, authorized at the level of the heir apparent rather than the sovereign, represented a precedent with no obvious parallel in the modern history of the household. Whatever it signified about the institution's health, it signified something equally significant about the distribution of authority within it, and about what that distribution now looked like. The name Andrew Parker Bowles appeared online before it appeared in any formal report. Someone had connected the thread. A detail mentioned in passing in a follow-up item, a reference to a private meeting requested through unofficial channels several weeks prior, and the connection moved through social media with the particular velocity of information that feels like discovery. Within 4 hours of the first broadsheet item, his name was the most searched term associated with the story across multiple platforms. A man who had spent years at the comfortable periphery of royal coverage, referenced occasionally in historical context and otherwise left largely undisturbed, found himself at the center of a question the public had decided it urgently needed answered. Why now? Why him? What had he known, and for how long? The palace issued a single sentence through its communications office at 3. It stated that the household did not comment on private financial matters. The brevity of the response in a situation that had by that point generated several hundred media inquiries communicated something that a longer statement couldn't have managed. It communicated that there was nothing being said because nothing that could be said would improve the position. The silence wasn't discretion. It was the last form of control available to an institution that had lost control of the story entirely. By evening, the question was no longer what had happened. The question was what a single public appearance, already scheduled for 3 days hence, was now going to look like, and what it was going to tell the world that no statement ever would. The service had been on the calendar for months, a national commemoration at one of the older churches in the city. The kind of occasion that exists at the precise intersection of the religious and the civic, where the royal family's presence is not merely customary but constitutionally weighted. The kind of occasion that cannot be cancelled without producing a statement and cannot be attended without producing photographs. Whatever had happened inside the palace walls over the preceding weeks, this was an engagement that would happen regardless. And everyone who understood the royal family understood that an engagement that cannot be cancelled becomes something else entirely. When the people attending it are carrying what these people were carrying, it becomes a text. Every detail of it becomes language. The cars arrived in separate sequences. This was the first thing the photographers noted, because the logistics of royal arrivals at formal occasions of this nature are never accidental. Who travels with whom in which vehicle, arriving in which order. These are decisions made through a protocol office that has been managing the semiotics of royal movement for generations. The separation wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that produced an obvious image on its own. But the people who had covered the royal family long enough to know what the usual arrangement looked like recognized immediately that what they were watching was a deviation from it. Small, deliberate, visible only to those who knew what they were looking for. Inside the church, the seating arrangement did the rest. Charles and Camilla were positioned in the same row as protocol required, but the distance between them, a space that would normally have closed naturally as the row filled, as it always does at these occasions, remained. Nobody had filled it. Whether that was a product of the seating plan or of some quieter negotiation that had taken place in the minutes before the service began, the result was the same. A space visible in every photograph taken from the press gallery, visible in the footage captured by the pool camera positioned to the left of the nave, a space that would by the following morning appear on the front page of 4 national newspapers without a single word of explanation required. William sat with Catherine several rows forward. He did not look back during the service. His attention remained directed toward the altar with the particular focused stillness of a man who has decided that the most powerful thing available to him in this moment is simply to be present, composed, and entirely unreachable by the atmosphere gathering behind him. Catherine sat at his side with the expression she had perfected across years of public life. Attentive, warm at precisely the right moments, revealing absolutely nothing that she had not chosen in advance to reveal. The moment that circulated most widely wasn't the confrontation. It was a photograph taken during the final hymn. A wide shot capturing the full breadth of the royal seating area, the voices presumably rising around them, the occasion performing its ceremonial function perfectly. In the center of the image, between 2 pairs of hands resting on order of service cards, was the empty space in the pew. Neither set of hands was reaching toward it. Neither was retreating from it. They simply existed on either side of it at a distance that the camera recorded with complete neutrality and the public read with absolute clarity. Camilla left before the formal recession concluded. A smaller security detail than her position would normally require accompanied her to the car. The adjustment in that detail, the specific number of personnel assigned, the vehicle used, the exit route taken, was the kind of operational change that goes entirely unnoticed by the public and is understood immediately by everyone inside the institution, as a recalibration of how the household now assessed her position within it. Car pulled away, the service continued, and the photograph remained, already moving across every platform that carried it. saying everything that the palace's single careful sentence had declined to say. The palace did not mark the change with any ceremony. That was consistent with how the institution had always managed its most significant internal shifts, not through announcement or acknowledgement, but through the gradual redistribution of small details that accumulate over time into a new reality. The absence of a formal statement wasn't oversight, it was policy. The palace had understood for centuries that the most durable changes are the ones that never have to be explained because they are simply allowed to become the way things are until no one can clearly remember when they became that way. Camilla moved to a country residence outside the immediate orbit of the working household. The move was described in no official communication as anything other than a personal arrangement. The distance it created, geographic, institutional, symbolic, wasn't named. It was simply established and allowed to mean what everyone who observed it understood it to mean. Her patronages continued to list her name. The organizations she had supported didn't receive formal notification of any change in her status, but the invitations that had previously arrived from the palace coordinating her appearances at their events stopped arriving with the same regularity. Then they stopped arriving at all. The organizations adapted as organizations do, quietly redirecting their correspondence and adjusting their programs, and saying nothing publicly that might require the palace to respond. Charles carried what he was carrying in the way he had always carried the most difficult things, visibly only to those who knew precisely where to look. His public schedule continued without interruption. His engagements, his speeches, his correspondence, his ceremonial functions, all of it proceeded with the consistency that the institution required, and that he had spent his entire life training himself to provide regardless of what was happening beneath the surface of it. Those who worked most closely with him noted only that the particular energy he had always brought to private conversation, a quality of genuine curiosity, of engagement with the person in front of him, was somewhat diminished in the months that followed. Not gone, diminished. The difference between a man fully present and a man present enough. William did not speak publicly about any of it. He didn't need to. The authority he now carried inside the institution wasn't the authority of someone who had won an argument. It was something quieter and more durable than that. The authority of someone who had been tested against a genuinely costly decision and had not moved. That kind of authority doesn't announce itself. It simply exists, and the people around it adjust to it. And over time, the adjustment becomes the new landscape, and the moment that produced it recedes into the background of a family's complicated history. Andrew Parker Bowles was never publicly connected to any of it. His name remained in circulation for several weeks, carried by the momentum of public curiosity and the media's need to attach the story to a human sequence of cause and effect. Then the coverage moved on, as coverage always does, and he returned to the comfortable periphery where he had always existed. Present in the historical record, absent from the present conversation, having done what he decided to do, and having left the consequences entirely to the people better positioned to manage them. What remained when the immediate noise had settled and the newspapers had moved on to other stories, and the palace had successfully reestablished the appearance of its ordinary rhythms, was something that didn't have a clean name. Not quite rupture, not quite resolution. The specific condition that a family arrives at when something true has finally been said that cannot be unsaid, and all of them must now build whatever comes next on ground that has permanently shifted beneath them. The palace doors didn't close behind her. They simply opened less often. And in the quiet spaces the royal family has always used to carry its grief, that distinction turned out to matter less than anyone had imagined, and more than anyone was prepared to say.